suffering for doing good. Finally, all of you, live in harmony with one another, be sympathetic, love as brothers, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil, insult with insult, but with blessings, because to this you were called, so that you may be inherited. Wait a minute. Can't even do the small words, let alone the big words. So that you may inherit a blessing. For whoever would love life and see good days must keep his tongue from evil, and his lips from deceitful speech. He must turn from evil and do good. He must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. These are the May God add his blessing to the reading of his holy word. Amen.
This passage that Ted read for us talks about how Christians are to treat each other. But immediately before that, it follows a section which gives instructions to husbands and wives. And so Peter concludes that just as it is important to pay attention to what goes on in your household with your family, it is important to be devoted to the household of God, the fellowship of believers that we call the church. This is just one of many places in the Bible that fellow believers are called brothers. We are to love as brothers. There are dozens of other verses referring to church members as brothers. And that's an all-inclusive word, not referring just to the male population, but to brothers and sisters, sometimes translated brethren. The Bible compares the church to a number of different things to illustrate what it's all about, such as the human body or a building. And even though the Bible doesn't actually use the words, the church is the family of God, it does say that we are God's household, and clearly indicating that this is another very valid illustration of how the church is to be understood. We are very much like family. We are to understand God as our Father. Jesus is our brother. And we are all brothers and sisters as part of the same family of faith. And just like your biological family is extended beyond your household, including grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins, so the family of God is extended beyond this building. Every believer in Jesus Christ is a part of the family, the church. But just like your biological family, your concept of family has more to do with the household in which you live. And while every Christian is a part of the family of God, we mostly understand church family life as what goes on with this particular group of people, either inside or outside of this particular building. There's a lot that we can learn about the church and what it is that God expects of us if we think of the church in terms of being a family. And as we look deeper at what it means that we are the family of God. Now, just about everybody has a family, so we can relate to that. A family that you grew up in or a family of your own. I know that there perhaps are some here today who have no family. They're all gone at this point, or you never had any. And that would be terribly hard. And I hope that you are able to look at your church as your family now. If not before, then maybe after this sermon. But for most everybody, when I say the word family, many different images just immediately pop into your mind. Strong images, I'm sure. Some good, some maybe not so good. Perhaps the images are of apple pie and swimming holes and family vacations and amusement parks. Or maybe they're more of arguing and problems and pain. Probably some of all of the above. But what you may not have realized is that the things that went on in your family when you were a child, or the things that now go on in your home, the ways that you relate to people in your family, either when you were a child or now as an adult, all these things have a very profound effect on how you relate to your brothers and sisters in the Lord as you work in the church. And if you've never learned things like cooperation or forgiveness or sharing in your own families, then it is very likely that you will have problems in those same areas when it comes to working with people in the church. The same patterns of communication and problem solving are used in your home are going to spill over into your relationships at church. So I want you to think hard about that. And it's a difficult thing to think about. But one thing that will happen when you make that comparison between the church and your own family is that you will understand in a fresh way that there is no such thing as a church without problems. Just as there's no such thing as a family without problems, because the church is a family. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Anybody here who has a family that have never had any problems with relationships within your family? Okay, I'm not wrong about that then. Of course you have. Every family has relationship problems, at least occasionally. Even back those sitcoms back in the 50s that we all love, so clean and wholesome, but not very realistic. But, Ozzie and Harriet and Leave It to Beaver. How many remember those? Some of the old people like me, okay? The Brady Bunch. Even those families had some problems, even if it was just Wally picking on the beeve or Jan being jealous of Marcia. Now, today, even those families might be called dysfunctional families. Another case of modern psychology gone kind of haywire with all their labels and their categories. Now, don't get me wrong, it surely is important to identify those dysfunctions in families that lead to abuse and neglect and mental and emotional illness. There are certainly many dysfunctional families, many families in torment because of just not knowing how to relate to one another and how to treat each other. And something has to be done to save those kinds of families. There needs to be some rooting out. Either kids need to be removed from those homes in order to be protected, or parents need to be removed in order to be trained to be decent parents. But it seems that anymore, if your mother made you eat lima beans, or if your father ever spanked you, that you're called a dysfunctional family. It's a way overused term. The simple reality is that conflict and problem solving are natural components of any family. And if those things are dysfunctions, then there is no such thing as a functional family. Well, my point here is that if the church is the family of God, then conflict and problem solving are going to be a big part of what goes on in the life of the church. And if it isn't, then the church really isn't family, is it? Now, it's true that some churches are so dysfunctional in how they relate to each other that it's just plain sick about how people treat each other. And there needs to be some rooting out in those situations too. There are certainly some dysfunctional churches. But most problems that come up in the church are simply due to the fact that we're family. And every family has problems agreeing with each other or getting along with each other every once in a while. And I'm not preaching this sermon because there's any particular issues that we're dealing with. It's just the fact that it's going to happen. It just happens from time to time. And if that's true, if every church has problems every once in a while, then why do we get so surprised and so disillusioned and so upset when problems occasionally crop up within the family of God? We've convinced ourselves that those things shouldn't be happening in the church. Now, we should be above things like petty arguments or challenging and competing with each other over little things. Well, maybe we should be above those things, but if we are really family, then what else can we expect to happen among brothers and sisters and parents and children? The Apostle Paul, in his letters to the early churches, addressed many such instances, some of which were major dysfunctions of the church which needed to be rooted out and dealt with, but most of which were just ordinary problems common to every church and most every family. One problem that most families face is sibling rivalry. Whenever there is more than one child in a family, there is a natural sense of competition between the children for things like their parents' attention, or for their possessions, for each other's friends, or perhaps just about achievement and recognition. Parents may try to do their very best to make everything totally equal, but that's nearly impossible. And even if everything were equal, there would still be conflict because one kid would want to have more than the other. And in some cases, it's a healthy, motivating concept. But in other families, it's outright war. Everything is a battle, from fighting over playpen toys when it's kind of cute and funny, to disputing over their parents' last will and testament, where it can get very sad and pathetic. Sibling rivalry is normal, and it should be expected. And if handled in a healthy way, then the siblings can grow up to maturity and be the best of friends, even though they were ready to kill each other as kids. All right, so in the church, which is the family of God, sibling rivalry is very normal and should be expected. It shouldn't be excused, but it shouldn't be all that surprising either. It is natural that members of the same church family will vie against each other for certain honors. Churches are notorious for people competing over who can do the best job at a certain position, or who can have a closer relationship with the church staff, or who the children of the church like the best, or who's been a member of the church the longest. I had a guy in one of my churches who was very upset because he thought he was a member of the church longer than anybody else in the church, until it was pointed out that there was another lady who had joined the church before he did. But he worked on it, and he figured it out that way back in the 40s, that lady had left the church for a few years and then came back. And so he actually had the most years of membership. No one else cared two hoots about it, but it was very important to him. Now, these things are laughable when we see them in other people. But if we looked at ourselves closely, most of us could detect some of this sibling rivalry in our church relationships. It's a natural thing that happens in a family. You're not an evil person because you've experienced this. But the point is that if we are ever going to mature in the Lord, this is something that we have to get over. The very tone of Peter's words in our passage for today indicates that this was a problem in the early church as well. It says in verse 8, "Live in harmony with one another. Be sympathetic. Love as brothers. Be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult." And as he goes on, it sounds kind of like a mother telling her kids to stop fighting. Come on, play nice. Don't tell lies. Don't try to trick your brother. Don't pick on each other. The Apostle Paul also had to admonish the church more than once for their in-house bickering and their family disputes. In the book of Philippians, chapter 4, he actually named two women who were not getting along, Euodia and Syntyche. Their names are forever etched in history as people were arguing in the church. And he pled with them just to agree with each other in the Lord, and for the rest of the church to help them to work out their differences. The book of 1 Corinthians is filled with examples of rivalry and competition within the church, to the point where it ended in permanent estrangement. And isn't that the saddest thing? When members of the same family feel that they can't speak to each other anymore? Do any of you have a biological family like that? You're adults now, but there's a brother and sister that you just don't have anything to do with, or perhaps a parent or an adult child that you just don't speak to. What a sad thing to have to go through. And it scares me when it comes to thinking about dealing with the church as a family, because of the inevitable conflict that always will arise within a church. Conflict happens, and rivalries and hurt feelings all come into play. But families who cannot just stick together are not living in obedience to the Lord. Now, there may come a time, just like in biological families, when it's necessary to leave the household. I'm not saying, oh, you're stuck here at Spinning Road Baptist Church for the rest of your lives. No, that's not the case. I'm just saying that if anything were to happen to make us feel like we can't treat each other in a Christ-like way, no matter what has happened, then we've missed the whole church about the whole point about the church being family. We may be an organized church, but then we would cease being a family. Because even though there are some hard things about being a family, there are a whole lot more good things. And even though the church, like the family, has to contend with things like rivalries or estrangements or dysfunctions, there's a whole lot more good to being the family of God than there is bad. One of the best things about being a part of a biological family is that you have a sense of security and identity. You're known by your family name. You feel comfortable in the familiar surroundings of your home. You see, the words family and familiar are very similar to each other. Your family is what is familiar to you. Your family gives you a place of safety and belonging, a place where you can just be yourself with the people that you're closest to. And even in those tragic cases where home and family are not a safe place for children, where there is abuse or neglect going on, still most of those children would rather stay with their family than be taken away. Of course, they'd rather stay and not be abused or neglected, but that need of being with familiar people and in a familiar place is so very strong. And most of us would be willing to give up a lot in order to keep that sense of security and identity that we have in family. Well, that same sense of security and identity is found in the family of God, the church. Sometimes it takes a while before you really feel like your family. And some people go to church all their lives and they never really feel that way because they've never really bothered to get involved in all that much. And we want you to know that if you're new here or haven't been coming along, or if you feel like you're kind of on the fringes of things, that we want so much for you to feel like your family, rather than just company coming to visit once a week, but rather family who belongs here. And those of us who know what it means to be part of the family of God have experienced the joys and the pain that go along with it. And let me tell you, the joys far outweigh the pain. The advantages in the sense of security and the benefits far outweigh any disadvantages. And having a place to belong to is certainly one of the greatest resources that we have as Christians. And that doesn't come just because of what other people do for you. It doesn't come from the organized program of the church. It comes as a gift from God. If you're saved, if you belong to Jesus, then you belong to His church. As Ephesians 2:19 says, you're no longer a foreigner or an alien, but you're fellow citizens with God's people, and you're members of God's household. You're part of the family of believers. Part of the good, the bad, and the ugly, all of it. But you're part of it. And it doesn't make any sense to refuse to be a part of the family when you already are, just by nature of being born again. You were born into your natural families. You were born again into your spiritual family, the church. And we who feel a part of this household of Spinning Road Baptist Church would like all of you to feel that way. Maybe we don't always behave as brothers and sisters in the Lord as we should, but still we're brothers and sisters because God made us that way. Perhaps the one concept that is the most similar between natural families and the family of the church is in this whole concept of sharing. In a part of a family, you are required to share, and to share many things. First of all, families share possessions. Even though family members might own particular items, most things in a typical home are pretty much community property. And the sharing of those things is what brings the family close together and makes them a family. You can't share a bathroom with people and not feel closer to them. You probably wouldn't want to share your soap and your toothpaste with somebody who's not in your family, but you do share those other things. Sharing the same toothbrush might be taken a little too far, but don't do that. But families share their things. They share their food. They share their toys. Kids have to share their toys with each other. A lot of families share bedrooms. They share their money. But when the church began in the first century, this was a big part of its identity. Acts 2:44 says that all believers were together and had all things in common. Selling their possessions and goods, they gave to anyone as he had need. Now, the church today does not have that same communal arrangements that they had in the early church, but still there is that conviction among believers that what's mine is yours. We could all tell story after story of how God's people have come through for others in time of need with great generosity and caring. And you are amazing in your generosity to our fellowship fund that we just took today, and how much help and love and friendship it extends to other people. Well, that's because that's what families do. They share their stuff. They share their things. Families also share hardships. Everybody has hard times to go through, but if you have a family, you don't have to go through them alone. And if one person in a family is suffering in some way, then everybody else in the family suffers too. It's not like you can say, well, I'm glad it's not me, because it's family we're talking about, and you feel the pain that somebody in your family is going through. And when a family goes through a hard time together, it's often what makes it or breaks it. Usually sharing hardship is something that brings a family closer together, but sometimes it can be something that tears it apart. As members of God's church, the family of God, that means that we share each other's hardships. Now, that might not sound too attractive if you're just looking into maybe joining a church. I don't want to share hardships. That's not a whole lot of fun, but that is what family does. When somebody else in the church is going through a hard time, we can't just sit back and say, well, I'm glad it's not me. If we are truly God's family, then when one member suffers, then everybody else suffers too. The Apostle Paul compares this to the human body in 1 Corinthians 12, verse 26, saying that if one part of your body hurts, then every other part hurts with it. Now, isn't that the way it is? If your little toe really hurts bad for some reason, then you start to walk funny. And then after walking funny for a while, then your back starts to hurt. And after a while, then you start to feel a headache coming on. Well, that's the way it is in the body of Christ, the church. When one member is suffering, then it affects the rest of the body. And it is in the sharing of our sufferings that we grow stronger in our love for each other. As 2 Corinthians 1:7 says, "And our hope for you is firm, because we know that just as you share in our sufferings, so also you share in our comfort." Sharing our hardships strengthens us. It makes us firm in our hope and in our love. Families share hardships. Families also share responsibilities. Everybody in a biological family has tasks to perform. And children can learn at a young age that they need to take responsibility for some chores. And that if they fail to perform their chores, then that makes all the more work for other members of the family. Now, no family would let one child do all the chores while another gets to sit and watch TV, unless it's Cinderella or somebody like that. But family life would be pure chaos under those conditions, unless responsibilities are shared among family members. Well, the application of this to the church is very easy and very obvious. If we as a church are truly family, then it means that we have to share responsibilities. It isn't fair or right for one brother to have to do all the chores while someone else just sits to be entertained. I won't belabor this point, we have preached about it many times, but the Bible is clear about it. If Jesus Christ has saved you, then you have been given a spiritual gift to be used for the church. And it isn't a chore to do what you've been gifted to do, but it sure can be a chore to do what others should be doing. And if you're not using your gift, then you are being disobedient to God, and you're being unfair to your brothers and sisters in the Lord. One other point I want to make is that families also share an inheritance. What belonged to the parents is passed down and divided up among the children. And this is something that I have seen in my life and career that has caused more strife and divisions within families than just about anything else I've seen, except maybe alcohol or abusive situations, which tears families apart. But terrible problems can arise when there's fighting over the inheritance, and that causes many families to completely sever their relationships. Isn't that ridiculous? Yes, dividing up property can be complicated, it can be difficult, but it's the property that should be divided and not the family. In my opinion, it's much more of a privilege and a joy to be able to share the property of your parents and others who love them than it is to just possess the property yourself. And there is that same sense of joy and privilege of being able to share in the inheritance that is offered to us by God with others who love Him as much. Sure, there will always be problems in the church, rivalries, disagreements, tough decisions to make, hard responsibilities to fulfill. But when you consider what it is that we have in common, what the inheritance is that we are able to share, then we should rejoice and praise God that we have been adopted into this family. Ephesians 3:6 says, "This mystery is that through the gospel the Gentiles are heirs together with Israel, members together of one body, and sharers together in the promise of Christ Jesus." Peter put it very simply in his first epistle, 1 Peter 1:3, says, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In His great mercy He has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade, kept in heaven for you." I hope that we've examined what it means to be God's family, and I pray that we would, as we're taught here, love as brothers, meaning in good times and bad, for all families have both. I pray that we would have that security and identity in being God's people that a church can provide. And I pray that we would share as families share, not only our possessions, but our hardships, our responsibilities, and our inheritance in the Lord.